Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. We are so happy to have you here with us for our 5th session in our Chapter of the Month program with Professor Chris Henning and our guests today. Our program today is Decriminalizing Race Pride, Free Speech, and Adolescent Identity Development. And we are thrilled to have with us today Dr. Kristia Wantchekon, Orlando Johnson, who is not just in Hansford, but he's one of his colleagues, and we're so happy to have him with us. And of course, our author, Professor Kristin Henning. So our goals today for all of you who are joining us is we are here to understand the impact of racism on young people's identity development, to focus on improving our attorney-client relationships with all of us who are youth defenders and youth advocates, and to develop strategies that we can use both in our individual advocacy and in policy work to include the concepts of racial identity development that we're going to learn about today. So let me introduce to you our wonderful speakers today. First, I'm Marianne Scali with the Galt Center, delighted to be with you all and so happy to have you with us. So I'd like to start with introducing Dr. Wantchekon, who we are thrilled to have with us. And in the brief time I've gotten to know her and read her work, I feel like I've learned so much, and I know that we're all going to learn so much for her today. So she is an incoming assistant professor of psychology and Provost's distinguished fellow at Georgetown. And we're so happy to welcome her when she moves to DC and have her with us. Broadly, her research is focused on the critical issue of integrating the literature around healthy racial identity development, and that process and its impact on academic adjustment and achievement, and helping us understand the factors that inform ethno-racial identity development. Kristia earned her BA from Yale and her master's in human development and psychology from Harvard and her PhD in 2021 from Harvard. And we're so excited to learn from her today. We're also thrilled to have with us Orlando Johnson, who recently joined the Thurgood Marshall Civil Rights Center at Howard University School of Law, where he graduated in 2020. And as a law student, Orlando worked with the Center on Activism on issues related to policing and prison book banning. And while he was a student at Howard Law, he also made significant contributions to a report on the prison book censorship project. He also worked actively as an engaged protester while he was an undergrad at George Mason University after the deaths of Trayvon Martin in 2012 and Michael Brown in 2014. We are delighted to have him with us today as one of our presenters, and also excited to learn from him about his work currently engaging young people in protest and activism and teaching about the importance of racial identity development as well. Professor Chris Henning, of course, joins us as author of Age of Innocence, How America Criminalizes Black Youth. We are so grateful to her for her work in developing this so that we could all learn and strengthen our advocacy based on her wisdom that she shares with us. And that has been rooted in all of our sessions so far in the program. Chris, of course, was instrumental in building our Youth Defender Advocacy Program. She's a distinguished fellow at Georgetown. She is a former lead of the juvenile division at the Public Defender Service in DC. She is our renowned scholar, and we couldn't thank her enough for all of her leadership and grace in all of this work. So for those of you who haven't been with us for the prior 4 sessions, you just want to ground this in our work of Age of Innocence. So our first sessions really focused on different aspects of adolescent development. We had with us Dr. Larry Steinberg at our first session, where we learned and dove into aspects of race in adolescent development. We've also had sessions already that focus on how this country criminalizes young people's actions, their sexual identity development, culture of young people, music of young people. And today, we're so delighted to be able to really dig into racial identity development. And this conversation flows from chapter 5 of Chris's book on policing identity, the politics of adolescence and Black identity development. We're going to learn about the role that protests and activism play in identity development and how we as defenders and youth advocates can really partner with young people in the fight against criminalization of racial identity development. So welcome to all of you. Thank you for being here. Thank you to our participants who are here with us today to learn with us. So we want to start this conversation really just thinking about young people in particular. And Chris, you've been representing young people in DC for over 25 years. You've met so many youth. And in this chapter, you share a number of stories about young people. And we're hoping as a thread, you could share a story with us to get us started.
Yeah, I think it's a perfect way to start this conversation about racial identity development. And chapter 5 actually opens with a story about a client that I call Jamal in the book. And so the short version is Jamal is he was a 15-year-old boy who was accosted by the police as he was walking away from his cousin's apartment building one afternoon. At the time the police officers approached him, they admitted that there was no report of crime, no citizen complaint, no call for service, no lookout for a suspicious person. But what they say is that they stopped him because he was in a quote unquote known drug area. And Jamal was pretty outraged from just immediately upon being called out by the police. And he knew in that moment that the police had absolutely no reason to stop him. And so he turned to walk away from the officers. The police immediately grabbed him and they tackle him to the ground. Now, it is that verbal exchange and the physical exchange that happens between Jamal and the police officers after they had tackled him down. And that exchange taught me just how incredibly much race shaped everything about Jamal's identity, including his sense of like who he was in that moment, how he thought he was being perceived and treated by the police, how he thought he was perceived and treated by the rest of society. At one point, Jamal is especially outraged by the fact that the police officers refused to pick him up out of the dirt after they had already handcuffed him. And so Jamal, just to give you the visual image, so they grab him, tackle him to the ground, they put him in handcuffs, and they have him face down on the ground, so that he couldn't run. But as he repeatedly tells the officer, I'm not going anywhere. You have me in handcuffs. All I need you to do is to pick me up out of the dirt. And the officers repeatedly refuse to pick him up out of the dirt. But worse than that, when he finally figures out how to like scooch his own body up and sit up by himself, the officers literally grab his ankles and yank him back into the dirt. And so he's completely outraged by this. Throughout the conversation, it's this long banter, verbal banter between the officers and Jamal. He says things like, y'all don't treat Black folks right. In fact, y'all do Black folks wrong. This is why I don't mess with white folks. This is why I don't trust white folks. There's a point at which the officers need to take his property. He's got money on his person, and they want to inventory the money. And he keeps saying, I don't trust you all, right? I'm not giving, he uses, let me be real clear, he's using much more colorful language than I'm using right now for our webinar, but he's basically like, I don't trust y'all with my money. There's another point in the conversation where he says that white police officers don't care about me. They don't care about my survival. He goes so far as to suggest that I have to carry a gun in order to protect myself because police will never protect me. And then there's a final point at which he gets really annoyed with one of the officers, one of the white officers on the scene. And he says that Black people are smarter than white people, right? Don't you all know that? So it's this really just intense banter that was just such a wake-up call for me in so many ways. Everything in this interaction and everything, to be quite frank with you, in his case in which we worked on, we represented him in, was explained by race. Race explained why the officers were always in his neighborhood, harassing him, searching him, even when he wasn't doing anything wrong. It explained why the officers kept him in the dirt, even after he had been handcuffed. It explained why Black neighbors came out to watch the police and to make sure the police were treating him fair. clearly. He explained why his mother taught him how to compare himself to white folks. Black folks are smarter than white folks. It really became like a survival mantra for him. And so it just was really powerful for me. And I thought it was a really important opener for this chapter for all the things we can explore about racial identity and how he came to see himself and to see police officers. So.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Kristin. That's a perfect way, not just to introduce the chapter, but to this conversation. Because everything that you talked about in this experience that Jamal had was about how he sees himself in relation to how the police see him. And so I want to turn to Dr. Wantchekon. Your work, Dr. Wantchekon, is just grows from scholars like Dr. Margaret Beal Spencer, who educate us on adolescent identity development and racial identity development. And so just to make sure that we're all on the same page, I'm hoping that you could just start out and help us and the audience understand that we have a collective meaning behind what do we mean by identity development? And then what do we mean by racial identity development?
Of course, yeah. So thinking about identity development more broadly, we know that adolescence is a period marked by enormous amount of physical change. We think about puberty, but not just puberty, but the neurological changes that happen in adolescence, but also a wide variety of social changes, right? So adolescents are oftentimes going to a larger high school where they just get exposed to many more people than they did in their elementary and middle school. Adolescents are often doing more extracurriculars. They're joining their first jobs. Their social circles are not, decided by who their family or guardians decide to connect them with, right? Because maybe they're learning how to drive, they can take the subway by themselves depending on where they live, right? So the expansion of the social world tied with these new brain functions, but also new things that their bodies can do, right? Just makes a really ripe time for identity development. And so as developmental psychologists, what we think about this section of life, particularly drawing from people like Erik Erikson, we think about identity really being the primary, what he called kind of conflict of adolescence. So, in other periods, you're kind of figuring out, okay, in like later periods, for example, in early adulthood, we think about relationships being one of the primary conflicts, right? Thinking about, okay, who do I want to be and who am I? And how can I find, working relationships, partnered relationships? But then in adolescence, it's really, okay, but who am I at all? And who do I want to be? And really solving that tension, solving that conflict is then laying a really important foundation to be able to be successful in the next stages of life, where, as I mentioned, the next stage is really around relationships, I think. And so thinking broadly, when they think about identity development, there's these two key pieces. And the first is really exploring and thinking about, and so that can be both attending activities, doing your own research, talking to peers, talking to your family about, a given identity. And then finally, resolution, which is coming to a sense of clarity about who you are and what it means to you. And so it's thought that when you have this process of exploration, which they think is really key to do in adolescence, that you then come to the sense of stability that then provides you a strong foundation as you transition into adulthood. And so as we think about ethnic and racial identity, we really just kind of bring that broader understanding into the domain of race and ethnicity. And oftentimes in this work, we say ethnic racial to really honor the fact that for some people, the ethnic parts of their identities feel the most salient, and for others, the racial pieces feel the most salient. For some, it's a combination of the two. And so it's really just to kind of hold space for all those different ways, particularly in the US context, people can kind of hold their identities with respect to these different types of backgrounds. But regardless, so we know that in the US context, race and ethnicity are extremely salient. They're salient in our legal systems, of course, in our schooling systems, and in our social society. And so we believe that it's really critical in the US for young people to be thinking about and explore and develop a sense of clarity about those identities. And this process has roots in adolescence, but again, with those new physical changes in adolescence, the new opportunities for social interaction in adolescence, it's really a time for it to blossom. And again, there's that exploration piece and that resolution piece, but instead of it being kind of broadly who you are, it's with respect to your race and ethnicity. And then feeling clarity about your ethnic and racial background and what it means to you. And in this part, we often think about, okay, so when we say stability, when we say this meaning that you're coming to, what are the different dimensions of that meaning? And so here is where we talk about what we'll call centrality, which I think really, connects with Jamal. So kind of how important your ethnic racial identity is to your sense of self, how you go into a space. Is it the first thing you would share about yourself? We also think about public regard, right? So again, this meaning that you've come to, do you feel like other people respect your background? How, like, what are your perceptions of what it means to be someone of your background in the social context of where you are? And then also private regard, which is how do you personally feel about your background? Do you feel positively about it, right? So when we think about racial identity development and ethnic racial identity development, there's this process piece, which is just, how are you exploring? How are you thinking about it? How are you developing clarity about it? And then what is the sense of clarity you're coming to? And then there's the meaning piece, right? Which can continue to change over time as you continue to explore. But then, okay, so you've come to a sense of clarity, but what is that clarity about? How do you feel about that identity? So I hope that is a helpful kind of primer on the way that we think about it in the developmental literature.
Absolutely. And Dr. Wantchekon, if you could just say a little bit more, and why is it so important? What are the positive benefits of establishing, getting this clarity around racial identity development?
Absolutely. So at this point, there's a big wealth of literature in this area, and we've kind of consistently found that particularly adolescents who have explored and developed that sense of clarity, but also who feel very positively about their background, that's related to better mental health. So lower anxiety symptoms, lower depressive symptoms. They perform better in school, so higher academic engagement, higher academic self-efficacy, they're more self-confident in the work they can do in school. And then also thinking about these social skills. So they're also more interested in interacting with people who differ from them in ethnic racial background. They feel more comfortable in those interactions. And also potentially even most importantly, given the context of our society, we often have evidence that particularly that stability, but then also feeling positively, can help to buffer some of the negative implications of discrimination on adjustment, right? So it's not only kind of positively contributing to these different types of outcomes for adolescents, but it's also helping to attenuate some of the really negative outcomes that we see when students or young people are in context of high discrimination.
And so just tying back to where we started with Chris talking about Jamal, can you talk a little bit about where you think he is based on that piece that Chris shared with us in his racial identity development?
Sure, yeah, I think as she highlighted, the centrality piece is definitely very clear with him. And he, his Blackness, and I views himself as a Black person in society, is a big understanding of the lens through which he understands his social interactions in the world around him. There's also definitely that private regard piece. He feels positively about being Black. And so even though he's in this very kind of like acutely racist interaction with police, right? He isn't internalizing it. He's like, this clearly I'm not the problem here. Clearly you are the problem here, right? So you kind of see in action what potentially some of that like positive self-concept can do to kind of buffer a negative interaction. Whereas someone else who might have lower affirmation or who may not have that kind of sense of self that he has may be like, well, I guess I shouldn't have worn this, right? Or yeah, like, I shouldn't have had my hoodie up. I shouldn't have come, they will start to think about ways that they could have been different or they could have changed the situation as opposed to kind of seeing the situation for what it is, right? And so, I mean, I can't speak to necessarily how much he's explored and how clear he feels, but definitely in his reaction seems to coming from a place of, no, I have an understanding of myself. And not only that, I have an understanding of society so that I can understand the situation for what it is.
Oh, I love that. And it just helps us understand so much about our clients and the young people that we speak with, engage with. And that's our hope, right? Is that they feel this positive sense of self in their engagement, and I feel like they can speak up for themselves. So Dr. Wantchekon, I want to take this, this positive sense of self and just ask you to talk a little bit about your research and your work. So you mentioned briefly in the benefits of gaining positive identity development, you mentioned academic achievement. So can you talk a little bit about educational outcomes and the impact of racial identity on educational outcomes, and what you're seeing?
Yeah, and so in this work, I do both kind of broad survey-based work with adolescents, but also intervention work. And so I think I'll focus mostly on the intervention work because it's what's newest and most exciting to me, but I think it's also kind of most relevant to the academic outcomes. And so in the work that I do with the project called the Identity Project, that's been a part of my dissertation research and my postdoctoral research as well, we really think about schools as this like central developmental context in adolescence, right? Teenagers often spend many of their waking hours in school, right? And they are key socializers with respect to the way that students think about themselves and their identities. And what's really key is that schools are not neutral. So it's not that either we're doing this work and making them really supportive environments for ethnic racial identity development, or we're not. It's either we're doing it or we're letting them continue to be harmful, because, you know, in a kind of like free market, quote unquote, like school context, it's going to be a harmful context because that's the way that it's been set up to work. Particularly when we think about ethno-racially minoritized students who often really suffer in our school systems for a variety of reasons. So our work has really thought about how can we kind of intervene in this context for good and leverage teachers, leverage, you know, students being kind of primed for learning by helping them then build their ethnic racial identity in school, and then hopefully see that having kind of these downstream impacts on their academic adjustment. And so originally in the randomized control trial that we did of this intervention, which was an 8-week intervention where students were in an elective, where they had scaffolded opportunities with their classmates to think about their backgrounds with respect to their ethnicity and race, and really puzzle over, you know, what it meant to them, think about who was in their family and how they identify, and whether that lines up with how they identify, you know, do interviews with people who are in their backgrounds. And then again, throughout all this, sharing it with their classmates, so building community in that way. What we saw was that the students who participated in that intervention compared to those who did not and received a kind of like basic college prep intervention, they had higher academic engagement, and they also had higher grades. And then when we looked at this cohort of students when they were seniors, because they received it when they were freshmen, the academic achievement gap that we saw in the control group that was very similar in the intervention group in 9th grade was significantly smaller among the students who had the Identity Project, right? So we think about, you know, just the power of them having this opportunity to really dig into themselves and create this safe space and build that kind of community, but also develop that sense of self at that point of transition in 9th grade. We know that 9th grade is such a pivotal year when it comes to then success socially and academically in high school, that we're seeing that it's really supporting those students. And now we're really trying to shift to not only, because before it was done by interventionists who were on our research team, but now we're doing it with teachers to leverage that relationship. And what we hear from kids is that they're so excited to have these conversations at school. It's making them excited to come to class and, you know, talk about the quote unquote real world, right? And not just, you know, something that happened in the past. It's like, how could we talk about how we make sense of what's going on right now? And, you know, developmentally, they love talking about themselves and they love talking to their friends, right? And leveraging and that kind of thing that they already love to do, but then tying it into the content that they're doing for school has been such a powerful has been such a powerful tool to see happen in action. And so I think it's just been really great to see how kind of powerful it's been for students. And again, we also do this with a very ethno-racially diverse group of students as well. So it's not just, you know, pull out for students who are from minoritized backgrounds, right? We're also seeing benefits for white students who are also kind of struggling with, okay, but I know this is sad, I know people are talking about it, but how do I fit into this? And who am I in this as well?
Thank you so much. So we're going to, in a little bit, talk a little bit about how this intervention work could relate to our work as youth defenders. But before we get to that, Dr. Wantchekon, I just want to talk a little bit more about the impact of racism on youth development. So what we see is that Black and Brown children have to engage with racial identity development, it seems to us, earlier than white children do. Black and Brown parents have to introduce this reality and begin really to help their young people, their children, explore their racial identities, because they want to keep them safe. They want to keep them safe in a world where discrimination and racial inequity pervades every system they engage with, their school system, their park system that we talked about. And because this happens much earlier for Black and Brown children as compared to white youth, what impact does that have? And what impact does the racism that young people experience have on their development?
Yeah, I mean, it is a really, sad picture. And I think of the work that we do, not only like in following students with surveys, with self-report, but also the like biological work that's done on stress and cortisol levels, right? So we see students who are reporting, high levels of discrimination, reporting higher anxiety, higher depression, students who are reporting high levels of discrimination in the school context, showing less engagement in school, right? Feeling like schools are a context place, or sorry, are a really hostile place. And also negative outcomes for wanting to interact with people who are different from them, right? Wanting to, put themselves out there and trust their peers. So really just across all indicators, it's hard to find an outcome for which we don't see a negative impact of discrimination on that outcome. And we also see it, not only in students kind of saying it themselves, but then also when we look at cortisol levels, right, of youth, even years after they're reporting high levels of discrimination, right, we're still seeing disrupted sleep levels, right? We're seeing like less responsive cortisol levels. And so we're seeing the way that even students who maybe aren't externalizing it and getting in trouble, but are internalizing it, are still kind of living with the weight and the tax of that discrimination as they're transitioning into adulthood. And so we think about the long-term implications for that we see in disparities in health, right? When we see things like high blood pressure, we see, just the disparities that we see, that oftentimes it can be directly connected to people's experiences of discrimination. And so I think as the research has expanded, it's been obviously disheartening, but I think in a kind of scientific perspective, heartening to see the ways in which we can continue to show from different perspectives that, no, these aren't just words, it isn't just hurt feelings, that this has a measurable and profound impact on people's development, on their well-being at the time, and on their well-being long-term, particularly if they're not being supported to be able to really make sense of and navigate the discrimination they're experiencing.
So Dr. Wantchekon, you mentioned words, and the words have meaning. And in the work that we do, of course, young people experience dehumanizing, bias, discriminatory language throughout their experience in the course system. And Chris talks about this in numerous chapters in the book. Can you talk just specifically about, the impact of language and words on young people and their development?
Yes, I mean, language is very powerful. And I think a great example of this is work by Tiffany Yip and colleagues at Fordham, thinking about even peer-to-peer teasing. So this is just teasing where teenagers are saying, my friend said this thing, they used this slur, but it was a joke and it was fine, right? And that's what they're reporting, but when they're tracking their cortisol, they're seeing still cortisol spikes that are not going down the next day, right? So that the students are still internalizing some of that, even when they're saying it's my friend and it's a joke. And granted, yes, like peers are a really important audience in adolescence, but we can think that if that's even the case when it's happening with between friends that we're seeing these negative outcomes, we can only think of what's happening when it's happening with somebody who's from a position of power, who they don't feel a sense of connection with, who they feel more threatened by, right? And I think the primary hypothesis of that paper was like, often people say, it's just teasing, it's just words, but it's having these real ramifications for these students. And so we can very genuinely extrapolate that that's very much the case when they're having those negative interactions, whether it be with police, whether it be with teachers, right? And so, yeah.
So, another concept that Chris has taught us a lot about, and she's shared a lot of research with us, is stereotype threats. So, we'd love to just ask you to help us understand a little bit more about stereotype threat and the impact, what it is from your perspective and how that impacts identity.
Sure. So with stereotype threat, I think it's easiest to kind of explain through examples. So it's basically, if there's an activity that your group is stereotyped to not do well in, and you're reminded of that stereotype before that activity starts, you'll do more poorly. So you'll kind of like affirm that stereotype. And so, for example, for me, if I'm reminded of a stereotype that, women aren't good at math or Black people are not good at math, before I take a math test, I'll do more poorly on it because I'm aware of that stereotype. That's taking up more of my kind of like working memory, my processing, and I'm going to do more poorly on the test. And what's really interesting that it's not just, they've done multiple manipulations, and it's not just, if somebody says the stereotype out loud or if I have to read it. It can also just be if it's made salient by the context, right? So if I'm going to take a math test and I'm being told that it's a competition and I'm the only Black person in the room or the only woman in the room, right? That stereotype, that might activate the stereotype threat, right? Or even if it's a classroom context where but that's what the teacher thinks, that can activate the stereotype threat, and then you'll end up doing more poorly. And with that type of what we'll call like identity-based threat, there's a couple different actions, but one, it's often with dissociation. So sometimes it can be dissociation with the identity. So it can be, well, I'm not like other XYZ, so I'm gonna do fine. Or dissociation from the activity. Like, I don't actually care about this math test anyway, so it doesn't matter. And if I do poorly, it doesn't matter because I don't care about this math test. And so we can see through those, potential ways of navigating that threat, the negativity, right, of like pushing yourself away from groups that you're a part of, but also the negativity of potentially disengaging from what like is an important outcome. So in the academic context, right, school performance. But I think what's positive to see is in the back end, even though it can shape identity development in that way, identity development can also shape identity threat in that if you have a really stable sense of self, a very clear sense of self, it's less of a threat to you. Like it might still have a negative impact on you, but you have more tools in your tool belt to be able to navigate it. So I'm not kind of like as shaken by, coming into a room and being able to present a background. I'm like, well, I feel very confident in myself. I feel very clear in myself. My parents have always taught me this. My community has always taught me that I'm good at this. So I'm going to go ahead and do it, right? So even though there can be that negative impact, and if you have these experiences, it can maybe have you dissociating from my identity. If you're coming into the experience and experiencing identity threat or a stereotype threat, having a really strong and stable and positive identity, it can also help to buffer some of the negative impact on that.
I love it. And that just matters so much to us. So, as adults who work with young people all the time, how do we help young people, gather that positive sense of self? How do we help, translate and transcend these, racialized perceptions that young people are receiving and may feel themselves? All of us, when we're adolescents, we care so much about what other people think about us. I mean, I know, I spent a heck of a lot more time getting ready when I was an adolescent than I do now. And young people just care so much about what their peers think about them, but also like teachers and neighbors and coaches. And so in your work, are you learning about to what extent young people are aware of racialized perceptions of them and what impact those perceptions have on their adolescent identity? And then again, to get back where I started, and what do we do as advocates, as defenders who really want to ensure that young people's strength and all of the skills and beauty that they bring are actually seen in court, and that the court itself doesn't take away from how they see themselves. So that's a lot. I'm just wondering if you have some beginning, and we'll get to this again later, but just a little bit about these perceptions that they're aware of that other people have.
Yeah, I think with like with a lot of things, there's a ton of variation based on like a bunch of different factors. One factor could obviously be just the context that they're in. Like, are they in a very homogenous context where they stick out or not? And that can be both, you know, because you can go to a school that's 100% Black, but all the teachers are white, right? So that is in a completely homogenous context. It can also be kind of what they've been taught by their family, right? So have their family since they're very young kind of minimized conversations about race and kind of passed on to them that like it didn't matter, you know, whether it's a bootstraps or it's a kind of color blind or color evasive narrative, what kind of messages that they're getting at home in those type of contexts. And then, you know, obviously themselves, right? Particularly now, kids get phones as young as 3. So kind of what kind of social context and like social in the kind of internet way, right? Are they also kind of traversing and learning and poking around and doing things? Because I think, you know, I've talked to kids as young as 10 who have like very kind of clear understandings of this is what it means to be someone of my background, my society, and here's the kind of historical legacy, and here as it shows up my life. And, you know, kids that are in college and are like, what? You know, have like no kind of like sense of understanding, like with respect to how people might see people of their background. And what ultimately, I think, and I think certainly right, students who are in hostile environments learn very early. I think one thing that I've learned in the classes that I've done is as a lot of students are reflecting on the first time that their identity was salient, particularly for students from minoritized backgrounds, 10 out of 10 times, it's because they were in elementary school and something racist happened to them, right? And so unfortunately, you know, for some people, they don't have those experiences, and maybe it happens a little later, or it happens, but they're able to contextualize, and then, you know, it happens again later. But I'd say that particularly among students of minoritized backgrounds, they do, and particularly moving into adolescence, have some understanding of, particularly if there's a negative understanding of what it means for someone in their background, they have some understanding of it. And the question is then, what do they do with that information, right? Are they then trying to kind of push away the background and lean into other identities? Are they leaning further into the background, like we saw with Jamal, right? And it's just like, there's these negative things that come with this, but this is my identity and this is what's going on, right? Are they being supported by their peers, by their family to kind of navigate it and then continue to hold on to the background? Or are they being told by those people to kind of continue pushing it away? So I think all that to say there can be different, lots of different factors that inform whether then if you're talking to like a given 12-year-old or 13-year-old, they'll be able to kind of talk you through how aware they are of the negative perceptions of people in their society, even if it's, you know, students of the same ethnic and racial background, right? And in terms of what do we do, right? I've talked so much about, obviously it's the students themselves, but also these different forces, right? So as we as adults in their lives, how can we, I think about the ways that we can build their critical lenses, right? So these things are happening. I don't want you to internalize them because they're not about you. Let me start in an age appropriate way to help you understand what is going on, right? So why might this happen? And it still not mean that you are less than, right? Or, you know, where might this teacher that did this thing to you be coming from, and what lens might they have? And here's why you should internalize it. So I think that as much as we can kind of build students' understanding of like, this is the way that the world works, and it can change and it will change, but this is why this is happening, right? Because so much of those first experiences of discrimination can be like, what is going on and why is this happening to me, right? And I think another critical thing is that we just model for them, right? Push back in our own spaces and speak up. I think a lot of times, I have a lot of friends that still work with high school students. It's like, yeah, you know, the kids are the future. They're so much better than us. And it's like, yes, and that's great. But if they're seeing you, you know, as an adult in their space, like not speaking up when something bad is happening, right? Or they're seeing you flinch and kind of grin and bear it, you know, how does that empower them to then kind of push back in their own space, right? Because it's sending mixed messages. And so I think that as much as we can model for them, you know, in the own work that we're doing and how we interact with other people when they're in our spaces, I think that can be really critical as we just help them continue to think about how they navigate those negative perceptions and experiences that they'll unfortunately inevitably face as they navigate society in the US.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Dr. Wantchekon. And I think now about, Jamal and his ability to speak up and really to just have this positive sense of self. And I want to keep thinking about Jamal as we turn to the next piece of this conversation, where we're going to turn now to Orlando and talk about youth activism. So, Jamal was speaking up as an individual, but we've seen so many young people become increasingly engaged in protest. And young people have historically been active in protest movements, the civil rights era, police-free schools movements. Orlando, can you talk to us a little bit about why so many young people have been attracted to protest moments? I think it pulls from and touches on everything we just learned from Dr. Wantchekon about how young people begin to see themselves and the context in which they develop. So Orlando.
Good afternoon, everybody. I think I can start with myself on this particular issue because I know it was around 2012. I was on a student trip out into Europe, and I remember looking at the TV and seeing this on the what do you call it, the chyron at the bottom of the screen, where it said that a young African-American kid was shot in Florida. And looking at the text that was on the screen, I saw where Obama had said, if I had a son, he would look like Trayvon. And this is the first time I'm introduced to Trayvon Martin, right? And I think being brought up the way I was, at that time, I really didn't think about race as often or as frequently or as, we were in that place as a nation where we were believing in a post-racial society because we had a Black president, right? And there was a lot of pride behind that. But I think that the timeliness of this tragedy ultimately spoke that to our conscience that there's a lot more work to do. For me as a kid, my last year in high school, I saw this as something that was awful and terrible that happened to another kid. And I felt like we all should have been on the same page on that. When I started bringing this up along with my peers, I realized that we weren't on the same page. There was a lot of people having discussions in regards to Trayvon Martin being scary and just being a threatening force in that space. And I realized that really quickly that we were in a post-racial society. So the thing is looking at Trayvon Martin, realizing that he represents not only someone in our community, somebody in our family, but very well could be a placeholder in the whole hashtag movement around that time, could be one of us. Really put me in this place where I realized that I needed to do something to ensure that our communities change so that there was a lot more empathy for our youth, for us in general at that time. So I think the reason why a lot of Black youth at times are getting involved in these movements is because they are implicated. And some people weren't kind of raised in the same boat that I was raised in. They were raised in environments where they were targeted every day, where police officers are on their block every day. They harass them every day. And they started to see other Black youth rise and take initiative in this effort, and it inspired them. And they said that I want to ultimately change the way that my community lives and how my community is monitored and how my community is protected. And I think that's why a lot of youth, and Black youth in particular, ultimately got involved in these protest movements.
Thanks, Orlando. And based on your own experience and the work that you've done, can you talk a little bit about the benefits of young people engaging in these protest movements? How did they grow? What changes maybe you saw in yourself, your friends, others that you've worked with? We've just learned a lot technically about racial identity development and centrality in public regard and private regard. How do you think engaging in protests shapes a young person's identity in a positive way?
I really see that as a real reclamation kind of like spirit. People are reclaiming something, right? And what they're realizing is that they're not getting the full picture in their schools. They're not getting the full picture in their academic spaces, whether it's extracurricular or it's within the curriculum at their local schools. They're not getting the entire narrative. They're not getting all the facts. And I think the first thing they really benefit from is getting the information that they should be getting in classrooms, whether it's their history, their lineage, how they got here, but also getting the, background on laws and laws that are on a national level, laws that are on a state level, a local level, getting a better understanding of what those laws are, why they were put in place, and how they still impact their communities to this day. And I think with that information, it gives them a lot more power, because when you know that there's an issue, you ultimately have a lot more of a focus in terms of how how you're able to uproot those issues. So I think information, knowledge is power. I think another piece is leadership. A lot of times, as has been addressed before, students are the only Black kids in their classroom, or they may be the most vocal. As they go into college, it's the same scenario. They really get to take this position in which there's a leadership role, and they get to advocate for themselves. And by advocating for themselves, that creates the opportunity for other people to kind of gather around them and support them in those efforts. So I think you have, information, you have leadership, you have community. These are things that benefit individuals in terms of a network. And I think as far as job opportunities come down the road, these are things that ultimately, like, they want to get involved in politics. They want to be involved in their city councils. That they want to get involved in, school boards. I think a lot of that comes from that background of ultimately being in a place where they feel defenseless, and then realizing that by getting involved in the process and being exposed to resources and organizations that are contributing to these efforts, automatically they start to see that they have a role that they can contribute to ensure that we're creating better communities. So I think those are some of the benefits that they're able to invest in, or get some of the benefits they're able to receive by getting involved in protests.
Thank you so much, Orlando. And I love that in terms of thinking about young people really learning so much, right? Like, and you named it, like information and leadership and self-advocacy and community. And there's just so much for young people to be gained in this awareness, and so much power for them to really to take, have, and use. So I want to turn now to Professor Henning. And you have written a lot in this chapter about the role of youth activism and civic engagement, and the role it plays in positive, healthy development. Can you talk with us about what we can do as defenders to highlight protest work as a strength in our advocacy with young people?
Yeah, I really mad shout out to Orlando for, sort of your thinking about all of the benefits of activism. I have to say that I've been so impressed with youth activism today in all of its many forms. Young people have been the absolute voice and leaders of the Police Free Schools movement. They've been speaking out against police violence. They've been challenging sexist dress codes like we talked about in our previous webinar. They've spoken out against gun violence while insisting at the same time that we don't need police in schools to keep them safe. So nuanced analysis. They've taken a stand on immigration rights. They've been demanding multicultural education. And so just as Orlando talked about, I've worked with young people, kids in high school who are testifying before city council, who have gotten signatures on petitions, who have been marching, who've taken a knee in the hallway, right? Like, Colin Kaepernick, who've organized social media campaigns. And so really I've begun to think about, and I think a lot of us have begun to talk about, how do we incorporate this like in our defender advocacy? So in disposition letters, in detention release arguments, negotiating with prosecutors. In fact, like literally just a couple of weeks ago, I was representing with one of my students, a young girl, Black girl, who started a youth group at her school. And so we were really highlighting that in our advocacy. And, look, the judge was impressed with that. And so it's a real opportunity to show judges, probation officers, other state actors that our clients are not just the sum total of whatever brought them into the court system, right? Whatever they got arrested for. So of course, if we really want to talk about this from a strength-based lens in our advocacy, it means we have to ask new questions of our clients in our interviews. And I will admit that like this hasn't been something that I have always asked my clients about. Yes, I ask them if they're involved in extracurricular activities, but I really haven't specifically asked about this kind of like civic protest or civic engagement in those kinds of ways. So I might, now, ask questions like, that will lead me there. Like, well, what are your views about the police? And have you participated in any activities to change policing in your school, in your community? So being very specific, have you participated ever in any kind of fight or campaign or protest to change something? How do you support other students in your school? What do you all do? And I think that's how we stumbled across the fact that this young client that we were representing, was also, she started a youth group, with a group of Black girls, and they wanted to get together and they wanted to talk about what their challenges were at school. So, figuring out how to ask those questions. And then I think the final thing I'll say about this is that and I will say two things. One is that we might also, as defenders, think about how to encourage our clients who are not involved in these kinds of activities to find spaces, safe, healthy, productive spaces. But then the final thing that I wanted to say about this really builds nicely on what Orlando was just talking about, these benefits, right? I think once we as advocates understand what our clients are actually doing, right, by asking the right questions, recognizing them as a strength, then we need to think about how do we argue those? How do we frame those? What's the narrative? And I think the narrative is just that. It's the benefits of this kinds of protest and activism to healthy adolescent development. And so Sean Ginwright, Orlando was speaking out of personal experience, and Sean Ginwright is another researcher who has done some really great work around this, and we can drop in the chat a couple of articles, but he really helped me understand all of these sort of benefits, including the one like Orlando already talked about, leadership skills, but also enhancing social emotional learning, resolving conflicts. How do you learn to collaborate and empathize and respect other people to achieve a shared goal? How do young people learn to navigate bureaucracies? How do you help young people find hope? How do we, not only the leadership skills, but this activism work also really improves the executive functioning, right? That big fancy word for, it improves that frontal lobe and how they learn to manage a project. So all of that. So I think we could use this stuff as defenders. I've really been moved by this conversation and by some of the reading, but we need to be highlighting it.
Yeah, and Chris, thank you so much, of course, for that advice in terms of really engaging young people in conversation about actions. When young people come in and we speak with them, it's never written in a police report about all this strength-based activism that they're engaged in. So really cueing us just to remember to just dig into who our clients really are and learn about how they see themselves and how they see the world. Because we know, Chris, even when young people aren't specifically involved in organized protest movements and formal engagement, you talk a lot in your book about young people who are engaged in other ways. I mean, it makes a lot of sense if a young person isn't mad about what they see happening in the world around them, that raises a question. But we know there's other ways that they express their outrage and their frustration with policing, with over surveillance, with harm, with murder that's happening in communities to their friends that they see. And again, you've taught us a lot in your book about the impact of young people experiencing in their own communities, but also just seeing on social media. What are some ways you've seen young people express this outrage, that's different from formal protest? And how could even those actions be positive and beneficial?
Yeah, it's such a great question, because to be honest with you, I would say, as a defense attorney, if I'm, being honest, I see more kids who come in who through these sort of informal, non-traditional means of protest, right? Because they don't feel like they're welcome, if you will. They are either not invited into the traditional protest spaces. They don't feel welcome when they get there. They don't trust the process, the political process, or they can't participate because of some competing obligation or some financial limitations. But as you said, they are just as outraged by all of the injustices, by all of the Trayvon Martins that they have seen. And so they've got to figure out, like, how do they speak out? And I think they end up speaking out. I see in my work, they end up speaking out in ways that are considered socially unacceptable. So they might talk back to the police officers, right? Talk back to teachers or other adults in ways that sound disrespectful, right? Spontaneous resistance. And, I like to always say, when they speak out, they're not saying, Mr. Officer, I don't like the way you're treating me. Instead, they are emotional and reactive, and sometimes they use profanity. They speak in ways that actually sound like a threat when they're very far from a true threat that we would really mean. But in addition to the ways in which they talk back, they also run from the police as a form of protest, refuse to cooperate with police in an investigation, refuse to call the police even when they are the victim. They might videotape police interactions. That's such a common form of protest. Like, that's how we got, how the world knows about George Floyd, is because as a form of protest, folks stood still. And it was the young girl who videotapes that. That's a form of protest. And so I think we see all of that. I talk about, the title of the book is The Rage of Innocence. Well, the rage is the rage that Black children have when they are told over and over and over again that they are criminal and that they are to be feared. Anybody with an ounce of dignity, an ounce of self-respect, as Orlando talks about, humanity, and any sense of self that Kristia talked about, you speak out, you resist those labels. And, as we already talked about, when you're a kid, you sound like a kid. When you're an adolescent, you sound like an adolescent. But unfortunately, so often, there's just an extraordinary intolerance of this kind of informal protest, but they are just as valuable, just as, beneficial as I think all the other protests, other types of protests, this notion of dignity, humanity.
And I love that part of Jamals' story where he says, I'm a child. Like,
Right.
I am a child. Like, I am acting like a child because I'm a child.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And we heard that 9-year-old, y'all remember that? The 9-year-old from New York who was pepper sprayed. And the officer tells her, you're acting like a child. And she's like, but I am. Literally, the 9-year-old has to tell, So it's just this sense of, I love the way, really Dr. Wantchekon has really helped me, sort of understand this whole, these kids are fortunate in the sense that they have some solid sense of self, right? Even when it's being challenged, they're in a place to push back. And so I think that's right.
So Chris, a lot of the pieces that you just talked about, kids, running, talking back, refusing to respond when, police call out to them, so they have opinions about police engagement, but they also have really strong opinions about how they're being treated, the legal process itself, the legal system as a whole.
Yeah.
And we've had clients who speak out against the actions of POs and judges and prosecutors. And then the court system wants to punish them for speaking truth about what they're seeing in the court system. So how do we as defenders defend? Like, well, how do we shift that narrative to make it clear to the system actors that the young people are responding in exactly the healthy way that we want them to be responding? So what do we do in those instances?
Yeah, I think we absolutely as defenders have to educate the other stakeholders that these kind of responses, one, are a product of normal adolescent behaviors, right? That have unfortunately been misperceived and distorted by racial bias, right? That a lot of these responses are normal trauma responses, fight, flight, freeze responses that, we've already talked about a bit. And as an assertion of identity, that's the new piece for me, I've got to say, out of this conversation. But this is an important part of healthy identity development. So I'm learning some new language that I hope I can sort of weave into my advocacy. And so I really want to go back and really be clear that so much of what we see in Jamals' story, right, in this verbal banter, is a normal adolescent emotional response. at a time in their lives when they do not have the skills, the capacity, the words, the language, to offer up this dissertation, this social, socially, I don't know, socially astute response. Adolescents are fairness fanatics. And I think we've got to get people to see that this is what we could expect from any child of any race, any class, all over the world, not just in the United States. I think that's one piece of it. This other piece is this helping, I think, folks understand context, that Jamal's reaction did not arise out of this one incident, right? But this is a accumulation of how he came to see himself as a Black American. It's accumulation of multiple experiences. He doesn't say, I don't mess with white folks out of the blue, right? Unless he's had some previous encounters, these sort of disorienting aha moments that, Dr. Wantchekon and Orlando talked about, like this moment when you recognize race is salient, to use, your word, right? These are how these come. And I think we as defenders can do the work, I think, of trying to educate other stakeholders of this context, really bringing in, as we're building the narrative, whether it's in the detention argument, again, the disposition argument, whatever, even in the trial, right? The defense theory, what are these narratives and contexts that inform what is happening and why it is that our client is reacting? And then educating the court on racial bias and how it is that these trauma responses, these normal adolescent behaviors have been distorted, right, by racial bias. So all the studies that, we can put yet again in the chat time and time again for you all, the studies, the empirical studies that we have been summarizing about the ways in which, Black child's behavior is perceived as more threatening, more aggressive, as angry instead of sad, how Black children are perceived to be older, those kinds of things. And that's true for boys and for girls and, folks who resist the gender binary. And so then the final thing I would say is, everybody, if you don't already have it, our language guide, our language and behavior guide that we created, we meaning the Galt Center, Georgetown Juvenile Justice Clinic and Initiative, Fair and Just Prosecution Project, and the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, the 4 organizations got together and we have this document that helps all of us recognize those behaviors that we see. So Marianne, you talked about how kids show up in court and resist, judges, prosecutors, with their arms crossed, rolling their eyes, sucking their teeth, scoffing when somebody says something in the courtroom, or just cursing and refusing to participate in the process. This document that Reba has just put in the chat is really helpful for us to contextualize that, for us to be able to help the other stakeholders understand what you're seeing is a normal adolescent response. What you're seeing is a trauma response, and how it's being distorted is by racial bias. So I hope folks will use that document.
Thanks so much, Chris. And thanks for underscoring the importance of context. Dr. Wantchekon talked about the impact of being in a hostile environment and how that impacts how a young person responds. We hear and we think about the young people that we engage with and interact with, and see that their responses make all of us understand that it's a result of their interactions that they've had and what they've seen. Chris talked to us about asking some questions to our young people about their engagement. Orlando talked to us about his experience in protest and civic engagement. And many people saw a video that went viral of a young 13-year-old girl in response to the murder of Patrick Lyoya in Michigan, and the voice that she gives. So I just want to take a minute and just watch this young woman, and then I want to talk a little bit about her response with each of you.
I'm going to say it again, I'm 13 years old. All of you are adults. Adults, right? You can drive, you can drink, you can vote. I don't have that. When I asked my mom if I could be dropped off here, her response was, is it safe? Is it safe? We had someone come up here and talk, and don't teach our children to disobey those who are protecting us. I don't see them protecting me. If you want to talk about those protecting me, I look to those who are standing right now because my trust isn't in them. I don't trust any of you. I don't trust any of the police officers because you have shown time and time again that we cannot trust you. I go to City High.
Okay, so that clip went round, and she's 13. She's 13. So, Dr. Wantchekon, I want to go back to the question that we asked about Jamal. Would you mind just talking a little bit about, her presence and how she may see herself in that space and that moment and what we can learn from her?
Sure. I mean, I think what feels really clear for her, even beyond kind of even an ethnic or racial identity, is just what we often talk about as like critical consciousness, right? So a kind of clear understanding and confidence around the systems, understanding of the systems, but also we think about that in connection with critical action, which is absolutely what she's doing, right? Standing up and speaking in this space and being heard is exactly when we think about critical consciousness, what we want to scaffold and support youth in doing. And, she speaks to having people in the audience who she feels like those are the ones supporting you, those are the ones, so I think it's just a great way to think about that tangible, visible support that young people need in order to move and make change, right? Because I think in a completely hostile environment where she didn't even feel like she had those allies, she may not feel fully empowered to do that. And so I think that when I see her, I think about people in her life, right? Whether it's her peers, her parents, her community that have prepared her and supported her, because she seems very agentic herself, like has her own agency and purpose for sure, but have supported her in feeling the confidence and sense of self to be able to step into that space and speak in the way she did. It's definitely very powerful to see.
So, Dr. Wantchekon, can you say that word again? Agentic, is that what it is, to have self-agency?
Yeah, so we think a lot about with adolescence, the importance of agentic engagement, which is
I love that word. I want us all to use that word in our advocacy. Yeah, it's a great word.
It's so important for them to feel like decisions aren't being made for them or thrust upon them. And so there's that agency or that engagement that comes from feeling like you have agency. So we often talk about in terms of like choice, in terms of, what kind of books you can read, what kind of projects you can do. But I think it can also be expanded into the kind of like civic and political sphere as well.
And I have to say, Marianne, that it also immediately reminds me of procedural justice, yes. Right? And all of the research in this legal space that children are more likely to comply with the rules, if you will, more likely to succeed on probation or whatever, conditions of release if they feel like they have agency, or they're more likely to accept the outcome if they have voice and an opportunity to be heard and meaningfully engaged around a topic. So it just resonated with me, sorry.
No, I love that. I love that, and connecting that to the sense of fairness and what's right. And really, the fuel of seeing what's wrong. And then again, just this agency of being able to speak. So Orlando, I want to turn to you. I don't know if you want to comment on this young woman and the power we all receive from her in her expression. But I'd love to hear from you, and then love to move on with you to talk about what could hold children and young people back from this type of engagement.
I mean, upon first glance, like you look at the video and it's like, oh man, she's so invested, like she's so passionate, she's charismatic, you know what I mean? She has like a lot of great qualities of a leader, and I love seeing that. But the thing is, like when I saw it, it broke my heart, because like when I was 13, I was playing video games, in the community, trying to figure out, where I was going to play a pickup basketball game or something like that, and here's this girl who's probably taking up like a Saturday or a school night, speaking about something that traumatized her, and I think in addition to that, her having no faith in her community her no faith in the public officials that are facilitating that process to handle it. And because she feels that her and her smaller community cares about it, feels a need is thrusted upon her to address it. Because people that look like her, people in her own community, people that look like her family members have been killed without recourse or have been impacted negatively by the officials that are supposed to protect and serve them. So, I mean, it's sad. It really is sad. I hope that she can really use the skills and abilities that she has as a leader towards something that serves her, you know, instead of something that she has to do in order to ensure that people can see her humanity.
Thank you, Orlando, so much for that. And just recognizing the weight and responsibility that young people, you know, young Black and Brown people feeling the weight of our failures, you know, and the structures of racism and how much we've put upon them. And, you know, this really does lead us to, Orlando, this conversation about what are the barriers to protest and the barriers to engaging that young people feel. You know, we talked earlier about ways in which we could support this level of engagement and, you know, positive engagement and in ways that it supports healthy identity development. But what are the barriers? And, you know, I think we pick right up where you left off in terms of how hard this is. So Orlando, I'm wondering if you wanted to just talk a little bit more about how young people may not have had positive experiences in engagement and why they might still feel like there are things that they see, but they can't quite make themselves engage.
You know, I hope that when we're all kids, we all have a sense of, or we're able to create like an idealistic world where everything works and sensational. I hope that, you know, as kids, our guardians, our parents, whoever they may be, really were able to entertain the idealistic world, right? Because I think at some point, regardless of whatever your background is, you realize the world is not as idealistic as you would want it to be. And as kids, I hope that there's enough hope that's invested in them that they still believe that that world is possible, but for no other purpose but to hold other individuals accountable as what we can have and what kind of communities that we can create. Because at some point, you know, all of us have to kind of make a sacrifice as into what tomorrow looks like. Because when tomorrow comes and we see the next generation rise up and they're dealing with the same issues, there's a little bit of conviction that's there. So I hope that we're able to kind of keep that childlike hope, that the systems and the structures that we operate under don't take that away from us, no matter how traumatic or how harsh a lot of their actions can be.
Yeah, and I think it goes right back to the title of the book, is The Rage of Innocence, right? And so we, in our hearts, just wish that there was this opportunity, that young people should have this opportunity to retain their innocence and to not have to face, you know, this oppression and this trauma and all that they're doing. What might hold back a young person from standing up the way that she did?
I think a lot of times, especially when you see kids in trouble, you know, it's not only a matter of them getting in trouble, it's a matter of them reflecting their family. Because when kids get in trouble, their family gets involved and their family may not have the time or may not have the resources to be able to show up at every occasion where they get in trouble. And that becomes a level of difficulty. So now that their parents are involved, they feel a level of guilt because now they have to navigate for the fact that not only did I get in trouble, not only did class get disrupted, but my family situation got disrupted. And now they're inconveniencing, now they have to go out of their way to make sure that I'm okay. And I think even when you start to think about, you know, people who get involved with the law, it's not just the school, it's not just the parents, it's the entire, you know, community at that particular point in time, the state that's getting involved. So it's really a matter, I think, in being present for them, making them aware, kind of trying to redeem some of the humanity in that moment and helping them to kind of rehabilitate them, recover, because at that point, if not already, they've kind of given up on the fact that they deserve any level of decency, which is why I'm glad to hear like story about like Jamal in his situation, right? Because while he's being, targeted unfairly, he's able to navigate to that matter thinking, I'm not the one at fault here. And I think that comes from a strong community and background in his family. And I think that, in all these issues and all these situations dealing with youth, you need a strong community that's around them so that they don't give up on themselves when they are unfairly targeted.
And Orlando, in your own experience, what did you have to navigate to get to the place where you were organizing and engaged in protests and really taking this leadership? What were the challenges and barriers that you may have faced as you began to get engaged?
So when I was in college, it was after the Michael Brown situation. Michael Brown was killed. And I think what really bothered us is that a lot of us we were traumatized. We weren't present for school or class. And there really wasn't any resource that was made available to us to ensure that we had space to recover, that we had a space to discuss and talk about what just happened. And I think the most concerning thing that we didn't feel that the administration was concerned enough about their Black and Brown students in a way in which they would allow us to have that space and that time. So I think some of the challenges that we had to face is that there really wasn't a framework for us to operate under. We had to figure a lot of things out. And eventually we got to that mindset where it was like, we had to stop asking for permission and just get prepared to ask for forgiveness, because we knew what we needed. And we knew that the administration didn't ultimately incorporate that into the curriculum. And we had to create that space. And I think what made a lot of those efforts, a lot of those student demonstrations successful is that we networked and that we worked with a lot of other student organizations that were on the yard. That became a framework for any other initiative that we had off the yard, that we made sure that there was a coalition of individuals and nonprofits and organizations, so that to make up for the ignorance that we had at that time, or just the lack of information, that there were people with information that were willing to educate and willing to inform, and most importantly, provide that space where protests became available to us. And we were able to participate in those spaces, be understanding what our rights were, understanding essentially what we were capable of doing in that space, what we were able to do in that space, pitfalls that we had to avoid, making sure that we weren't getting involved in counter protesting, that we were staying focused on what we came to do. And most importantly, ensuring that there was like mental health resources that were available, whether on the campus or off the campus as well. So I think networking really made up for a lot of the things that we were short on. There was a lot of, I'm gonna say there was several school administrators and people working in inclusion and diversity offices on campus that made themselves available, many times stayed up till the wee hours of the night to make sure that things worked and make sure that we were aware of what things could ultimately make it not work. So I really go back to that sense of having a community of individuals that say, hey, you're not alone in this. We've been through this as well in some capacity. And we want to make sure that you're successful in all that you do so that we can help shoulder a lot of this effort with you.
So I love the learning from that. And Dr. Wantchekon, it looks like you're leaning in, but I just wanted to link what Orlando just spoke to us about to our work in the defender community, right? I mean, so you talked about you had to build community. You couldn't get distracted by the protests, right? We can't get distracted by the narrative of the prosecutors and probation and courts sometimes. And that we had to take care of ourselves. We had to make sure the mental health resources were there, right? Those three key elements to what you figured out as a college student, I just think are beautiful and so helpful as we think about how do we engage in this work as a community of youth defenders and lift up what is positive and take care of ourselves so that we can keep going in face of so much that is so hard all the time. So thank you so much for sharing all of that. Dr. Wantchekon, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I love those connections that you just made, and what you were sharing as well was just making me think about, we think a lot about externalizing symptoms of students who potentially experience discrimination, and then act out, and then the students who experience discrimination and then internalize it. And really understanding, I think, as a literature now, that both can have adverse experiences, or have adverse outcomes, or not outcomes, responses for students. Because I think a lot of times people will look at the kids who are maybe experiencing things and, taking it on the chin and being like, that's the way that you should do it. And we see all these negative impacts for those students. And so I think what you're talking about, students being able to, or young people feel like they can be heard, but then also taking care of themselves in that process seems like such like a perfect balance, right? Of not like being self-destructive in speaking out and hurting yourself in the process, but also then not being self-destructive and just trying to keep it moving and push through school and just try to keep it and just try to keep it going. So I just really love that balance that you were talking about, of being able to kind of get those feelings out and also feel seen and heard and create change, but then also making sure that that self-care community is happening on the back end as well, I think is just so critical.
It's so connected to what we're trying to do as defenders, right? To ensure that young people feel heard. Chris, were you going to jump in there?
No, I think what I keep listening to, I love the story. I love the frame, that Orlando is sharing and that the two of you have sort of broken down. A piece of me, though, is still thinking about my subset of clients, right? Whose challenges are so extreme, or they've lost that hope that Orlando talked about. Mm-hmm. They've lost that trust in the process, right? Or they don't even know who the networks are, right? So I think I have this is really helpful for me, thinking about the continuum of clients that we serve, right? So some will be in that Orlando space, are pretty darn close to that Orlando space with a little bit of a push, a little bit of support. But then there's this whole other set of my clients who have a little bit higher, a lot higher, honestly, taller hill to climb. And so thinking about using that same frame, right? How do we help our clients, those clients in that category, not get distracted from the counter narrative? And it takes me back to something that Dr. Wantchekon said earlier about really helping our clients understand, unfortunately, this is how systems work. It's not about you. So it's all about strength-based advocacy. And I don't mean to use that word flippantly at all. I really mean spending time to dig deep, get to know what your client's strengths are, and highlighting that both for them in the moment and for the other state actors. But so it's that buffer, right? Like, I know this all seems bad. Teachers are coming at you. Probation is coming at you. Nobody's giving you an opportunity to speak. Everybody's labeling you, but I see you. I hear you. Let me ask the right questions. So I think that may be part of the helping our clients work through those counter narratives, right? Let me sit with you, client, and let's figure out how we could tell a different story to probation or to the judge. And then your next piece, which is about how do we take care of ourselves? How do we help those clients take care of themselves? It's helping those clients find culturally competent. I hate that. I don't even know what I want to say. I hate the word, but culturally appropriate, culturally sensitive, trauma informed, but not the regular trauma informed, but racially trauma informed services and mentors and get into programs like the Identity Project that Dr. Wantchekon runs, and the work that Orlando is doing. How do we help our clients connect up with those spaces, right? I think maybe another way, then the third way, you talked about, sort of using our networks and, letting them be heard, asking clients, what are you experiencing? What are some of those traumas? What is it that you want to say? How are you feeling about that police shooting? And I know that feels uncomfortable for some folks, right? But that's not what we're here for today. You got arrested for shoplifting, but it actually is completely relevant, to that shoplifting, not, so much the act or the behavior of shoplifting, but how they interpret it and how they're seen by society and what could have happened to them if they had been caught. And so That's my initial reaction.
Yeah, and it's so much about them making sense of the world around them, right? And responding to the world around them. And so, in that, Chris, what are some things you're seeing young people get arrested for rising out of formal and informal protest actions?
That's right. Like, so where the administration doesn't have the tolerance that they had, in Orlando's case, right? Like, they don't ask permission and they don't get the forgiveness either, unfortunately. So many of my clients, our clients come in, I'd be curious in the chat what other defenders are seeing, but threats, when a child speaks out talks back, as they call it, to the police officer, it gets interpreted or labeled as a threat to do bodily harm against the officer. I've seen clients get charged with unlawful entry for failure to move on, because in my jurisdiction, we don't have that as a standalone. So if they're camping out, even in a formal protest, right, it's unlawful entry. My clients get arrested for simple assault when they are, when they're terrified, to be quite frank, of an officer using excessive force. And so they, respond. So simple assault. They also simple assault when they try to intervene because a friend or a relative is getting what they perceive to be hurt by the police. We see clients coming in for obstruction of justice, either for attempting, like I said earlier, to prevent some sort of police harm, or from just recording the police. In some cities, that's unlawful to record the police during an action. And then, obstruction of a school day, obstruction of educational process for taking a knee in the hallway. So you see a lot of kids get arrested for, thank you, Farah. Farah put in, terroristic threats, defiant trespass, third-degree aggravated assault on a law enforcement officer or a school board employee. I'm sure other defenders can weigh in with what are we seeing when kids speak out for themselves, or if they're engaged in formal protests, what they come to court.
So, Chris, I want to come back to you and talk about defenses, but first I just want to ask either Dr. Wantchekon or Orlando, if you could help us understand any of these actions as a function of adolescence and even as a form of identity development. We'll see who unmutes first.
Well, yeah, I would just say, like, particularly, and not that this is the only time within which this is true, but I think particularly now, this can be a way within which, youth are exploring their background and what it means to them, right? I think really coming of age as an adolescent right now, particularly as a Black adolescent in the summer of 2020, and often meant grappling with some of what was going on with the protests in the street, the conversations online, the conversations at home, et cetera, right? So engaging with that was them doing some of that exploration themselves and kind of figuring out, like, okay, what does it mean for me to be here? How do I feel here? How's this making me feel? Is this making me feel like clear about, just kind of engaging in that as a process of their exploration towards their process of developing resolution. I think we could definitely see it as part of that.
I love that. Thanks so much, Dr. Wantchekon. So helping us really understand that, this exploration and making meaning making of the moment, and how this could be part of their self-expression and identity development. All right, so Chris, back to you. So now, how do we use some of this beautiful work that we've learned about from your chapter and Dr. Wantchekon and Orlando in our defense?
Yes, happy to. But I want to make sure, Orlando, were you about to jump in?
I was just gonna I don't want to hold anything up. I just want to.
No, please. Thank you, Chris.
Okay.
I missed the cue. Thank you.
It's all right.
I just wanted to hear the question one more time so I can answer it effectively.
So we were asking about so what we see young people getting arrested for, whether it's property damage or vandalism or graffiti. How are those a function of adolescence and even as a form of identity development and really expression?
I love how Miss Chris put it in her book, right? And speaking about adolescence and how adolescence was this thing that was really established because we understood that there was this bridge between people when they're a kid versus when they become an adult. and their mind is still functioning and the brain is still developing. And it's this critical period of time where in which, kids make mistakes, they make reckless decisions, but is necessary in order for them to better understand their role in society and how they can ultimately contribute to it when they get older. And we do all these things to make sure that in a general sense that adolescence is this thing that people are able to enjoy, that they're able to make these mistakes without huge repercussions, but those same things are not afforded to Black youth. Black youth are not able to make those same decisions before they become criminalized or vilified in our society, where we see in areas like Baltimore or DC, whereas we see the biggest issue is that we have too many youth that are out unsupervised creating acts of villainy, and they need to be suppressed, and we need to have curfews in place in order to ensure, but there's no alternative programs to ensure that, okay, what are the mental health services you need? What are the extracurricular activities that you need? What are things that are going to help you be able to get acclimated to the curriculum that you have at school, right? So we are quicker to vilify Black adolescents than we are to ultimately give credence and give benefits to white adolescents in that same sense. So in that same breath, where in which we are ultimately trying to correct behavior as a community, as a society, there needs to be those alternatives that are available for Black youth, so that they understand that when they make a mistake, that there's an entire community there to back them up, so they don't take a step backwards. Not a community that's ready to condemn them and try and find a prison cell for them when they get older. And that has to be that reinforcement and that encouragement there in order to ensure that they benefit from what resources we have available.
Thank you so much, Orlando. And thanks for giving us that additional context and understanding about how we really need to be thinking about these alternatives and creating spaces for healthy development and healthy spaces. So, Chris, when I was asking you to talk to us about defenses, I really wanted to start with what are some of the legal defenses, like specifically, that we can be articulating when young people get brought into the legal system as a result of these expressions.
Yeah, I think, we're going to talk in a couple of months about policing as trauma, right? The empirical research documenting the psychological impacts of policing on Black and brown children, and, not just policing, but, racial trauma. And I think when I think about defense theories, I think if we're incorporating some of that research, right, we're understanding that, for example, a child who is engaged in simple assault, I think we naturally can think about self-defense, right? But I think adding that extra layer of context, that this moment is so critically important because it is the center of that identity formation. It's the time in life where we are fighting, grappling. I'm probably overstating, the doctors pull me back, but I think of it this way, as this notion of grappling, fighting for who we want to be and who we can be in this moment. So Jamal's actions, he's talking back. Had he not been in handcuffs, it probably would have been physical. But there's this pushback that I think is arising out of all the trauma he's experienced as a Black person, having multiple encounters with discrimination. It's the unique trauma associated with policing, and it's amplified by how they're treating him verbally in that moment. And so I just say that to say self-defense to me is even more enhanced by understanding both identity development and understanding sort of the policing as trauma. I think same thing with threats. Why isn't threats? Can we, write that brief, if you will, right? Make the oral argument and write the brief explaining how that verbal outburst, right, wasn't a threat. It wasn't a true threat as we understand it legally, but instead it's an assertion of one's identity, which is, guess what? Really important part of adolescent development. Can we also, right, talk talk about it as a trauma response, right? It's an emotional reaction to what I feel my identity is being threatened, right? And I definitely think in Jamal's case, right? He's like, you're not respecting my identity. I'm certainly not about to respect you. I can't, do that. I can't engage with you on that level. So I think that's a piece of it, really thinking about creatively about defenses. I think a lot of it is, all the unlawful entry, getting into this the First Amendment rights, right? Obstruction of justice is, can I argue defense of a third party and First Amendment, when I've got a traditional obstruction of justice arising out of my filming, right? It's got to be a right to film the police officers, particularly if I'm in a public space and, it's my public right. So those are just some quick things that came up as I was thinking.
And Chris, then just to add on to that, and can you imagine us using some of the racial identity development learning in any of those defenses or advocacy?
Yeah, I mean, I think, for example, just like again, threats, I think is the best one, right? Like I am asserting myself, I am asserting who I am as a person, a Black person, a person of color. I am speaking out against any denial of a right to me, for me to be me, if you will. That's really oversimplified, but I wonder if we could I think it's just a creative lens. I certainly have never tried it. I certainly would be open to it.
So then to kind of connect to that, Dr. Wantchekon, you talked to us about all of the benefits of developing, positive ethnic racial identity development in young people. Could you talk a little bit about, just from your own perspective, what would be the benefits to identity development for young people to engage in protest and activism and expression in these ways?
Yeah, I mean, I think as I touched on a little bit before, a big piece of adolescence is not only this identity struggle, but also feeling like you have agency and kind of like striking out on your own, whether it's in your own opinion of yourself or your own action. And so I think that feeling, both affirmed potentially in those like protest spaces, but then feeling like they can create change and kind of hold on to that, more childlike hope as well, to kind of tie back to that idea as well, I think can be just really important for them. And feeling right, as just affirmed in those spaces, feeling powerful in those spaces, feeling like a change maker in that space, I think can really help them as they're settling into who they are and be like, okay, this is who I am, and I'm proud of it, and I'm comfortable in it, and I feel powerful in it. I think is such an amazing feeling to get to experience as an adolescent, right? And I think can only help young people then as they're growing up and continuing to navigate these different spaces, in different ways, and potentially encountering other things, whether it's professionally or, in communities or whatever it is, right? I just see there being a lot of potential in being able to kind of feel like they can intervene in those spaces and feel powerful in those spaces.
Right, and just this notion, as you said, of being able to impact change and to create change and hold change. And so before we move off of this and talk more about, what we can be doing as adults to create this space, Orlando, is there any other advice you want to give us about how to support young people in speaking out for themselves and taking action? You gave us such pearls of wisdom earlier. I just want to make sure that we don't miss any of them before we move on.
I mean, my biggest thing is always just listening to kids. Me growing up as an adult is realizing that, okay, not too long ago, I was a kid myself. And I think one of the biggest things is I wanted to be heard. And so when I'm talking with kids, I give them that opportunity to still be a kid and whatnot, but, kind of also treat them as an adult, in the sense that the same kind of respect that I would offer an adult, I want to kind of also extend to kids too, kind of give them the opportunity to communicate what's going on. Why do you feel this way? If your thoughts are valid, that I want to give you the opportunity to speak your piece, so that you know, in essence, I have a better understanding of how I may help and or serve you in that space. So I think that's a key thing, understanding that kids are people too, that they have their own concerns. And many times when you hear these kids' stories, it's heartbreaking. And you understand kind of where, you know, why they react and they respond to structures and frameworks the way that they do. I mean, it's really sad. So just giving them the opportunity to be heard, understanding that you're there to be an advocate, that you're there to help, I think that's critical.
I love that. So listening, so key to everything that we do. Thank you. So I want to now ask us to just think about, you know, contexts and spaces that we as adults and teachers and lawyers and activists have responsibility for. And Dr. Wantchekon, I just want to start with you and just bring us back to why is it so important that we provide spaces, that we create spaces, that we really think about how to structure spaces that nurture healthy racial identity development. And I want to include in that, you know, what we're going to get to in just a few minutes is this attorney-client relationship in this space of court. Why is it so important that we think about this framework in this context?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so important because all of, you know, adolescent social world and their social spaces contribute to their developing identity development. And spaces, you know, thinking about schools, for example, and then the multiple relationships that happen within them, they're not neutral, as I mentioned, right? So either we can be creating and transforming them to be supportive of students, or if left to their own devices, they won't be, and they could actually be actively harmful, right? I know people use in a lot of anti-racist work, right? The moving escalator, right? If we're not moving, we're still moving away from justice, right? And so I think oftentimes when, you know, you might be in a school, you might be in a justice system where it's like you as a person cannot fully transform everything that they will experience. But what you can do, right, is create the safe space of that relationship, whether it's as a teacher in a classroom or as, you know, an attorney with your client, that they feel safe and supported to explore themselves and feel just solid and stable and affirmed in themselves. And those relationships are powerful. I know there's a ton of research on the power of mentors. I know there's a lot of work with Noel Hurd, who's at the University of Virginia, around just, you know, even having that adult relationship, whether it be someone in the community, whether it be a teacher, whomever it might be, who makes them feel safe, who makes them feel supported, is hugely important in adolescence well-being and development. So, you know, why not, you know, ideally, it would be beyond just an attorney-client, you know, relationship, and why not it be that relationship as well?
Thank you so much. And so you talked a little bit about the school context and really nurturing relationships and how those relationships can be positive or they can be negative because they're not neutral. So Orlando, I want to talk to you and just talk about this current context of schools. You know, Dr. Wantchekon told us it's one of the most important spaces. It's where young people spend so much of their time for us to create really healthy racial identity development in schools. But recently we know all this conversation and pushback on critical race theory and the message that gives to young people and the message it gives to young Black and brown young people who are told they can't learn about the true history of this nation. And I know you're doing some work in this space, Orlando, and hoping you can just tell us more about that.
What I find interesting, well, I'll start with this. I think Black students know that there's something missing in their curriculum. I think that's the critical thing, even without being exposed to it, without even hearing about it, specifically in their courses in regards to literature and history, civic engagement. I think they know that there's something that's missing. And I think that's reflected in terms of how they receive their curriculum and how they feel like ultimately everything they learn will not be conducive for them and their growth and their development. What I find interesting is looking back in terms of, you know, integration and ultimately combating segregation in this nation after Brown versus Board of Education. There was really a push by Black and brown students for their history to be covered in courses, and it was met by violence, where police officers would meet them at the school as they're protesting and beat them with billy clubs and send them to hospitals while they are demanding this desire to be taught their history. And I find that it's tragic, but I find it interesting on the basis that today we're getting closer, at least prior to 2020, we were getting closer and closer to incorporating Black history more effectively into our curriculums, whether it was through literature, history, etc. And teachers were feeling more and more comfortable having these open conversations about race and gender and sex identity and things of that nature in terms of how their students were navigating through current events. And now, because of critical race theories, you have teachers that are afraid to discuss issues that don't only affect students, but affect them as well, right? Because of how their state legislatures have ultimately, selfishly, have handled this issue, right? And the thing is, many people think about it from the perspective of, okay, Black history is not being taught, but it's also racial sensitivity training that's not being taught. And that hurt students from several perspectives. One, because they're not being taught how to be basically better stewards. And I'm speaking about like students that may not be in the Black and brown community. They're not being taught to be better stewards within their own communities, how they use their privilege and their resources to help others. Teachers are not able to teach on these matters. Security guards and unfortunately even SROs, right? Who there's a whole nother conversation about police officers in schools in that sense, are not even required to take racial sensitivity training because of critical race theory, anti-critical race theory legislation. And what makes it all the worse is what's being banned from school is not critical race theory. Critical race theory essentially is just this legal study in which we're looking at laws and saying how these laws need to be destabilized in order for there to be better freedom in our communities and in these social spaces and whatnot. Those are being taught in at lowest college classes and mainly legal courses. But now it has been redefined. I think the term is the definitional theft, where in which they're using it to ban Black history, racial sensitivity training from schools. And how it hurts our students is now they don't have that opportunity to develop, understand, how they can make their communities better, how to invest in the structures and frameworks that need the investment in order for them to have the resources and people like them to have resources. They are polarized because the thing is, just because they're not getting it in school, they're getting it off of social media. They're getting it off TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, and they come up with all this good information and they can't discuss it in class because they know that there's going to be ramifications for that. So that there's a freeze, there's a chilling effect on the curriculum, which many times just tells students that we don't care about your history, we don't care about your involvement, we don't care about your contribution in this classroom.
Thank you so much, Orlando. And it's kind of unfathomable. I mean, I know we have said that about so many things over the past 4.5, 5 years that we're in this space in 2022. But thank you for pulling that in for us to help us understand the impact. And I think it connects so much to what Dr. Wantchekon is talking to us about, is creating spaces that nurture positive racial identity development. And Dr. Wantchekon, I'm just hoping you can just jump in and talk to us about what characteristics are there of spaces that nurture positive racial identity development, and what does this do? This taking away, as Orlando said, not just critical race theory, but racial sensitivity training and conversations and opportunities to have conversations about race and relationships in our communities.
Yeah, I mean, that was a word, Orlando. Thank you for saying all that for sure. But I think what's really important for these spaces is that adolescents feel heard and feel supported, that the learning is scaffolded, right? So it's not the situation of like, okay, we're gonna come in, I'm gonna tell you about your history and how you should feel about yourself as a person of this identity. It's they are feeling like they have the opportunity to do that learning and thinking for themselves, and certainly that it's scaffolded, right? So those activities like we have in any project, like interview someone in your family, like go and take pictures of things in your in your space, in your community, and think about how they connect back to how you think about yourself with respect to your ethnicity and race, right? So this kind of educator supported, but student, adolescent driven activities, and have the opportunity to share what they're learning, right? With you and with others. They love the opportunity to share with their peers. I think so many students, when I talk to them about these types of curriculum, they're like, I feel like I kind of knew my classmates or even some of my friends, but it's pushed us to have these conversations that we've never had and know each other on a deeper level. I remember one student said, it's like, I know what my friends' labels are, but I don't know what those labels mean to them, right? I thought that was like such a poignant way to think about it. Like, yeah, my friend is Dominican, but what does that mean to her, right? What is that? How does that like show up in her life? What experiences she had related to that? And so I think those types of spaces are key. And as Orlando was saying, as we're highlighted, those spaces are being taken away, right? With trainings not being able to use the word equity, with hotlines for teachers who are teaching, classes about race and racism, where the schools are intervening with in the fall, even up here in Massachusetts. Some of them are like, I feel 100% confident to teach this, but what I'm worried about is I'm not trying to end up on TikTok and then at a school board meeting, right, where my license is being revoked. And how horrible that the teachers are really like, I can understand and see how important this work is. And what I'm worried about is not my ability to do with my students, it's how it's going to be turned and changed and pulled to try and come for my career, which is just, heartbreaking for the young people today, heartbreaking for their educators, and heartbreaking for all of us who are doing this work.
So, and I love that you're both honing in on the impact that relationships have, right? So just really taking away this opportunity to build relationships, to build conversations, and to create community about race and to talk about our engagement with each other. It just deprives everyone of the opportunity to grow. So, Chris, I want to make sure we get to this conversation about the attorney-client relationship, because in our work as youth advocates, what does this mean for us? And so learning from both what Orlando shared and Dr. Wantchekon shared, how can we use this information to enhance the attorney-client relationship? If we have some time, we're going to come back and hear one more time from each of them, but I really wanted to get to this piece on attorney-clients with Chris.
Yeah, I gotta say, I've been sitting here. It's so funny to be in a webinar as one of the panelists, and I'm literally taking notes as I listen, because this is just such rich stuff. And one of the things that popped in my head is that, we often talk about how important as youth advocates it is to be quote unquote culturally competent without really understanding why we need to be culturally competent, if you will. And I think I hope we all walk away from this conversation with, two things. One, a better understanding about why race is so critically important to adolescence, right? Particularly from the lens of this, of the impact that it has on racial identity formation, but also walking away from the conversation with a desire to have a deeper understanding of who our clients really are. I was really moved. This is one of the things that I wrote down. Dr. Wantchekon, you just said that one of your students taught you, I know what my friends' labels are, but I don't know what those labels mean. I feel like we should think about our clients that way. We can look at them and make assumptions, right? Like everybody else in the system is about our clients, but are we really asking those questions that would allow us to get to know them in a deeper way? Some other things that occurred to me as I was listening, throughout the 2 hours. One is really understanding that, I hope we know this, but really understanding that race is relevant to our clients, even when it seems irrelevant to us in a particular moment, in a particular case, in a particular conversation, but that racial identity formation is happening or is impacting their understanding and interpretation. So I think we need to really understand that. I think all that we've learned from both Orlando and Dr. Wantchekon really should help us improve our client interviewing. in a very, practical way. I have a, client interview protocol. I need to enhance that protocol, to dig a little deeper. So maybe that, Marianne, will be one of our next projects. What is, a sample interview protocol look like that we can put on the racial justice toolkit just to get us started, right? Like, I think also too, another thing that really resonated with me, another point Dr. Wantchekon made earlier, this notion of we have to model for young people by pushing back and speaking up ourselves. And so for me, I immediately wrote down that underscores the importance of both zealous advocacy for the stated interest of our clients and the young people that we serve. That goes to Orlando's point about listening. How is it that I can help you, right? Not me dictating, but how can I help you do what you seek to accomplish? But then also it underscores the importance of raising race in our cases. Right? For those of us who are practicing in the delinquency system, how do we be allies? So I thought a lot about, when at various points when Orlando and Dr. Wantchekon were speaking about all the allies, the teachers who should be allies, right? In all of these moments, but we as defenders can be allies when they want to protest. So in client counseling, I kept thinking about, there are some clients who might not want to plead guilty in a case for no other reason that I have a right to protest. I have a right to resist the way the officer treated me. So again, these are just some things that popped into my head. I found it very, very useful. Thank you, I'll say to both Orlando and Dr. Wantchekon for my thinking as an advocate, a youth advocate, about how to improve those relationships and to be a better advocate. So.
Thank you so much, Chris. And Chris, you also have taught us many times about how to be interrupters, right? So that's exactly what I thought about when Dr. Wantchekon said, we have to be good models. Like we can't allow these harmful, racist statements to be made in the systems that we exist in and reside in without interrupting them in some way. And of course, you've taught us so much about how to do that well and how to do it effectively. But I want to just ask Dr. Wantchekon and Orlando, if you could just, in the last couple of minutes, we have each give, one last piece of advice to our community about how we can help nurture positive racial identity development in our roles as youth defenders. And so, Dr. Wantchekon?
Yeah, I'll just quickly say, the old adage of, put your mask on before you try and help someone with theirs. I think positionality work is so important. We all come to the work that we do for different reasons, and we all occupy different spaces in the work that we do because of our own experiences with ethnicity and race, because of our ethnic racial backgrounds. And doing that work with yourself is just so critical in order to be able to help youth do it, because if not, I think that interaction can be potentially fraught, potentially triggering, right? As students are working through it as well. So I think it's just very critical in our work with educators, we really focus on this. So I would say, as you're trying to build that work with your clients as well, but it's important that you think about yourself and do some further exploration as well.
Thank you so much. And Orlando?
I would say that when you're doing work that benefits kids, you think that the things that you're doing are so mundane because you've been so involved in your, academics. You at this point, like you went through high school, you went through college, you went to law school, got your degree and things of that nature. You think things are a little bit boring, and then you present them to kids, and it just lights up their entire world because that's new information to them. So I say never take for granted essentially what you can contribute and offer to somebody's narrative. Kids are coming in from stories, have narratives that they're coming from, things that would just blow your mind in terms of just how much they had to withstand to get to where they are. But also, even if it's like a small sparkle of hope, like that one thing that they hold on to in order for them to kind of navigate each day, you can water that by ultimately being present and allowing them to kind of tell their story while also giving them some good information that would ultimately expand their world.
Well, that is a beautiful note to end on, sharing information that will hopefully expand the world to the young people that we work with. Thank you so much, Orlando. Thank you, Dr. Wantchekon. Thank you, wonderful Chris Henning. You are all magnificent, extraordinary people. We're so grateful to you for sharing this time with us, your expertise with us, and all of this information. And I hope that we all take with us, as Orlando said, some hope in recognizing that this work and learning about racial identity development really can strengthen everything we do in our interactions with young people, wherever we are in this work. So thank you so much. I hope you hear resounding applause from our community across the country who has joined us. And we hope to see you again at Chapter 6 next month. Thank you all so much.